I have the honor and privilege of introducing our main speaker tonight. Sanjeev Sanyal, noted historian, author, and economist. He will take us back to the time of 3,000 years ago and speak about the merchants of Meluha. I was just reading the chapter in your book, sir. He is a principal economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, the Government of India. He's a Rhodes Scholar and an Eisenhower Fellow. He's the author of so many books, and I've listed them all in the message that I sent everyone. He's a much sought after speaker. It was very difficult to get him because he's always on CNN and other TV channels speaking about the economy. But today we've requested him not to speak that much about the economy, though it's at the top of everybody's mind on this lesson, and to speak about the cycle of time and how once again we can survive this crisis. Thank you, Sanjeev ji, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Namaste, everyone. Let me say that, yes, it's given the last few months and the events, I have not had any time at all to think about my work in history. So it's in some ways quite a relief to talk about something else other than GDP growth, credit growth, and other such things. So as you can imagine, so what I'm going to try and do in the next, let's say, half an hour, 40 minutes, give you a flavor of what I think is interesting even at this time from a historical perspective, which is that India, of course, has a very long history of exploration, trade, business, risk-taking, etc., which goes back to the very beginning of time. And I thought I'll give you a flavor of that because in some sense, it will give you also a flavor of the twists and turns of our economic history. So I thought that might be an interesting thing to take into account, even at these times, because in some ways we are going through one of the major breaks in global economic history. Not since the Great Depression and the Second World War have we gone through such a major shock to the global economy, of course, of the aftershocks of which we are feeling here in India as well. So let's go back right to the beginning. If you came to India 5,000 years ago, let's say 3000 BC, then the landscape that you would have seen would have been very, very different. This is a landscape that in which you would have had, first of all, it was a much wetter place, perhaps a little bit cooler. And if you looked at northern India, what you had was two very large rivers flowing north to south. Of course, one of them was the Indus or the Sindhu, but there was another river which is mentioned very frequently in our ancient texts, but has dried up today, and that was the Saraswati. Now, the dry riverbed of the Saraswati is still visible today. We call it the Ghaggar. And this river essentially started in the Himalayas, went past what is now Chandigarh, through what is the Thar Desert, and they ended up, both of these ended up in what is now the Run of Kutch. Now, those of you who have ever been to the Run of Kutch will know it as the Salt Flats. But in fact, if you were there 5,000 years ago, it was not the Salt Flats. It was actually the estuary of two major rivers. Both the Indus and the Saraswati used to flow into the Run of Kutch. So it would have looked much more like the Sundarbans looks like today. So that is what it was. And in this area that you now know as Gujarat, you had not just this estuary, but also Saurashtra, which was, by the way, not a peninsula, which is today, but an island. And so when we talk about this period, we typically tend to talk about Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, etc., which were found on the Indus Basin. So that is why we have come to know of this civilization also as the Indus Valley Civilization. But subsequent excavations now suggest that there were actually even more cities and archaeological sites along this dry riverbed that we now know as the Ghaggar, which is almost certainly the Saraswati River mentioned in the Rigveda. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the northern history of it, except to say that there are major sites, much bigger than Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which have been found in eastern Punjab, in Haryana, northern Rajasthan, and so on. For example, Rakhi Gadi, which is a huge site, perhaps double the size of Mohenjo-daro. Now, this part of the history I'm not going to get into, because I'm more interested in the mercantile history of which was happening down in Gujarat. And there is a huge site called Dholavira. Now, Dholavira is today a marooned sort of island, but not an island surrounded by water, but surrounded by the salt flats of the Run of Kutch. But as I said, the Run of Kutch was an estuary and there was water everywhere. So this Dholavira was actually a port. And if you go to Dholavira, you will see it's a huge site. And from there, the Harappans used to sail westward out towards Oman and through the Persian Gulf to what is now Bahrain, and then finally to Sumeria and Mesopotamia. So if you go to museums in Oman or even in many of these Gulf cities today, you will find that there are a large number of Harappan artifacts found everywhere. There were Harappan beads, there are Harappan weights and measures, probably also cotton. And it is interesting that in Sumerian texts, in cuneiform texts and tablets that they have left behind from about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, there are mention of a people called the Meluhans. Now, who were these Meluhans? The Meluhans, we find out from them, came from the east, and they brought with them things which are quite clearly Indian. Ivory, they brought beads, they brought peacocks. So it was quite obvious that this refers to people coming from the Indian subcontinent, almost certainly coming from, some of them would have come from Dholavira and the general area of Gujarat. Now, the first mention of a person who is clearly an Indian in any text outside of India happens in these Sumerian texts. And you have a court case that is mentioned of a Meluhan who is indicted by the Sumerian court for breaking the tooth of a local in a drunken brawl. Now, my guess is that this is the origin of prohibition in Gujarat. Now, this world that I just described is very interesting because it's not like there is a world here in India and there is a world there in the Middle East that is separate. The reason we think of these as separate areas is because there is a large chunk in the middle, the Balochistan in eastern Iran, which is now a desert. But since I told you the climatic conditions then were completely different, there was actually a grassland in what is now Balochistan, and there were lots of people going back and forth. So this was, of course, a lot of the trade happened through mercantile trade, but they were actually going right back and forth. So, for example, the westernmost Harappan site is in the Iran Pakistan border, which is very far east, and which is an area which is essentially and today inhospitable, not far from, by the way, the modern port of Gwadar. And on the other side in Iran, there was a civilization called Giraffe, which clearly suggests affinity to Indic civilization because they have humped cattle, and many of the things they have, for example, there were some of their seals clearly show things like the Pashupati seal, very similar cultural affinities. Now, this world that I just described, however, suddenly came to a grinding halt circa 2000 BC. That's 4,000 years ago. What happened is that we went through a massive cataclysmic climate change, and everywhere in all these areas, things became suddenly very dry. Now, we have records of this from Sumerian texts and Babylonian texts which mention how all these cities were dying as all of this was happening. This same thing happened here in India. The Saraswati River, which was already drying up before this, completely dried up. The estuary became the salt flats that you see today. And all these large cities, Rakhigarhi, Harappa, etc., had to be abandoned. Now, many of these people then migrated out. Many of those living in Gujarat seem to have migrated onto the Narmada Valley. Many of those from the area in Haryana, Punjab, etc., migrated. Some may have migrated westward, but certainly some of these people migrated onto the Gangetic Plains. Now, they were not migrating into completely empty areas. There were already people living in the Gangetic Plains, and very recent research done just in the last few years suggests that there was also another civilization which was just as old as the Harappans living in the Gangetic Plains. And we have just a year ago dug up in the Gangetic Plains near Bagpat in a place called Sanauli, artifacts from that civilization, including a full horse chariot, which goes, by the way, in case those of you have been following these old Aryan invasion type theories of the past, it'd be interesting for you to find that the oldest chariot in the world is not found somewhere in the Northeast or even in Central Asia, but in the Gangetic Plains in India. We have also found a shield, helmets, a bronze sword, very large bronze sword. Some of this, hopefully we'll put it up in a museum shortly, but you can Google up a Sanauli museum. But this world that I just described fell apart completely. Now, before I go into the next phase, it is interesting here to just think about what was this world that disappeared doing. It was clearly doing a lot of trade back and forth. And we have found now sites even in Central Asia, which have products from these Harappan areas. I already talked about Oman and so on. And we know that we were exporting beads and cloth, particularly cotton textiles, to them. But the question then arises, what were we importing? And that is a big, big mystery because we do not really know. Nothing obviously Middle Eastern or Central Asian origin has ever been found in any of our sites. So there was 1,500 years of trade and we have no idea what we were importing. So it was clearly Atmanirbhar Bharat of some sort. But we can guess. One thing very likely we were importing was copper. So although the northern Indian sites had copper from Khetri mines, which are basically even today major copper mines near the Haryana, Rajasthan border. But it's very likely that areas around Gujarat were importing them from Oman because we have Bronze Age Omani copper mines that have been found. And they have also been found with various Harappan seals and so on. So very likely they were trading that. But the other thing they were very likely trading was horses. Now, the old theory was that horses were being imported, came to India with these Aryan invaders. Now, that entire theory has been thrown into the dustbin. But we continue to believe maybe that they were bringing, that at least we were importing horses from Central Asia. That may well be true. We may have been importing some horses from Central Asia. But in fact, there is more and more evidence that horses are not in northern, but a southern animal. And that the place where they really were first domesticated is perhaps Arabia. Well, not so surprising. Arabia has always been famous for its horses. And there are actually 10,000-year-old horses in rock paintings in the middle of what is now Saudi Arabia. We also, by the way, it's likely that India had its own horses. Because if you go to Bhimbetka, which is near Bhopal, you will see these cave paintings full of horses. And those cave paintings are 10,000 years old. So when I'm talking about this landscape that I talked about, this was a continuum. It was a continuum through northern India, through Balochistan, which was a grassland, moving on to Arabia. And there were people moving back and forth. And that is the reason there was such a lot of cultural affinity between Indians and Iranians. It had nothing to do with Central Asia. Why do you need to go to Central Asia when Iran and India are right next to each other? So this is the world that suddenly fell apart when this climactic change happened. And so the old cities fell apart. But now a new a sort of world emerged out of this. And that world was centered around more east towards the Gangetic Plains, but also moving into the Deccan. And from the Deccan, a completely new technology emerged, which was iron. Iron and steel, later on steel, but initially just iron. Now, excavations done in Hyderabad University now suggest that the earliest systematic use of iron anywhere in the world happened in India at around about the time that the Harappan cities were collapsing. And this technology then moved on to the Gangetic Plains by about 1500 BC, and they were widely used. So again, the old Aryan theory that they came on horses using iron tools and swords to conquer India is utter bunkum, because first of all, Indians already had horses. They clearly had chariots, which are older than the ones you see in Central Asia. And guess what? They also had iron weapons. So clearly this was not a country that would have been easily conquered by some small group of Central Asians coming in and conquering India. But in this new environment, large numbers of cities began to now proliferate in the Gangetic Plains. And some of them are still around. For example, Varanasi. In fact, it's quite likely that Varanasi is not just an Iron Age city, it may be even a Bronze Age city, just as old as the Harappan cities, but has survived to today. And when you go to Varanasi, if you go to the Ghats, you will see that it looks a bit like a hill. In fact, it's not a hill, because it's in the Gangetic Plains. There's no hills anywhere around. The reason it feels like a hill is because it's layer on layer on layer of archaeology. So if you dig there, you will keep going. In fact, there have been many digs done, and you keep going down through you go through the medieval period, you go through the Gupta period, and you'll go down to the Iron Age. And perhaps there are now increasing suggestions that there may have been a settlement there, even in the Bronze Age. So this is a very different view of Indian history than before. And now what happens is that the mercantile action, because as I said, the Western ports had sort of that trade network had kind of fallen apart. But we now begin to see, interestingly, activity begin to take off on our eastern coast, particularly in the zone between Chilika Lake in Odisha and the westernmost outlet of the Ganga near Kolkata. And you begin to see lots of Iron Age site proliferate there. There's a huge site just north of Kolkata called Chandraketugarh. And so you have lots of activity happening from there. And you begin to see sailors begin to make their way down along the coast. At this point, they didn't know how to cross the seas. So they make their way along the coast. And some of these Bengali Odia sailors begin to settle in Sri Lanka. And that is the reason why, by the way, why the language Sinhalese, which is the majority language of Sri Lanka, is related to Odia and Bengali and not to Tamil. There is, in fact, an ancient legend in the Sinhalese, which is the foundation legend of the Sri Lanka, that a prince called Vijaya made his way along the coast to Sri Lanka and settled Sri Lanka. So interestingly, the majority population of Sri Lanka is actually related to people far away in Bengal from where Vijaya is supposed to have come, than right next door to the Tamils who came and began to settle it somewhat later. Now, the same group of Odia Bengali sailors made their way along the coast in the other direction. So they sailed along the coast past Burma, and they came to the bit of Thailand, which is known as the Isthmus of Kra. This is the bit from which Malaysia hangs off, not very far from Phuket. And from there, they crossed to the other side, to the Gulf of Siam, or Gulf of Thailand. And then they sailed further out towards the Mekong Delta, to what is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on, and began to explore all those areas. Now, there is a legend about this exploration, not from India, but from Vietnam and Cambodia. And the legend goes as follows, that a long, long time ago, maybe it was somewhere in the 6th century BC, a Indian ship, a merchant ship, was sailing along the coast of Cambodia, along the Mekong Delta, or the Vietnamese coast. when it was suddenly attacked by pirates. And when it was attacked by pirates, what happened is that on board was a ship captain, a handsome Brahmin called Kaundinya. So Kaundinya rallied all his sailors and they fought off the pirates. But unfortunately, his ship developed a leak as a result of this. And he was forced to beach somewhere nearby to carry out repairs. So while they were carrying out repairs, suddenly a local tribe, a local Naga tribe, the serpent tribe, suddenly surrounded them. Now, things look really bad because, as you can imagine, they were surrounded on all sides. So, nevertheless, Kaundinya again rallied his sailors and they were going to defend themselves. But things looked quite hopeless. At this point, they had a stroke of luck because the Naga tribe had a leader who was a warrior princess called Soma, or the moon-faced one. And Soma saw Kaundinya and fell in love. So instead of attacking them, she proposed marriage. Now, I suppose Kaundinya didn't have too much choice in the matter at this stage. So he accepted the proposal and they got married. And they set up a dynasty which would create the first Indianized empire in Southeast Asia called Funan. And of course, Southeast Asia would then carry on to have many empires of the subsequent thousands of years. But even later, when the empires of the Chams and Angkor, etc., emerged, all of them would try to establish their lineage all the way back to this marriage between Kaundinya and Soma. Also interesting is that most of these lineages were not patrilineal, but matrilineal, which of course makes sense because Soma was the queen and the whole lineage was from that lineage. But it is also interesting that many centuries later, when the Pallavas would establish a kingdom in southern India, they would establish their royal lineage not through the male line, but through the female line. And they would talk about a marriage to the first Pallava king to a Naga princess. Now, till recently, you always wondered where this Naga princess came from, but my guess is that she was a Southeast Asian princess from somewhere, a Vietnamese or Cambodian princess. And that is what gave a royal a royal lineage to the Pallava kings, who would then go on and, of course, build these great temples in Mahabalipuram, in Kanchipuram, etc. So this is the story of trade. Now, by around about the time of Christ and the Roman Empire, this whole thing changed very significantly. Because on both the coasts, we discovered how to use the ability to cross the seas using the monsoons. So by the 1st century AD, you had Roman fleets sailing all the way down the Red Sea from Alexandria and other places on the Mediterranean, and they would make their way to the Red Sea and sail down the Red Sea. And from the Red Sea, they would come to an island called Socotra. Socotra, by the way, it's an island off the coast of Yemen, and it actually has a Sanskrit name. It comes from Dvipa Sukhadhara. Sukhadhara, the island of happiness. That's where the name Socotra comes from. And from Socotra, they would either sail to Gujarat or along the coast, and many of them would come down to the coast of Kerala, where there was a major port called Muchiripatnam, or what the Romans knew as Muziris. And there was hundreds of ships going back and forth. And in fact, so much shipping was going back and forth between these two. That the Romans began complaining about Indian exports. Because while the Indians imported lots of, the Indians were exporting lots of cloth, they were exporting steel products, iron products, weaponry, and spices, of course, but remember, many of the spices were not Indian spices, except black pepper, by the way. Most of these spices was spices from Indonesia, which the Indians had bought from the Indonesians and were selling on to the Romans. But the problem was that Indians were only importing very limited products. And we know that the things they imported was Italian wines, Greek olive oil, Syrian wines as well, good-looking women, by the way. Indian nobility of that time were really having a good time. And the page 3 crowd of the west coast of India of that time liked Italian wines and Greek olive oil and good-looking women from that part of the world. But they clearly weren't importing enough of it because they still run a huge current account surplus. So how did the Romans pay for this current account surplus? They paid for it in gold coins. And so much gold coins were coming to India that it caused a crisis in the Roman Empire because they didn't have enough gold and silver to mint their own coins. So initially, they tried to ban trade with India. But that failed because obviously the Jews and the Nabateans ran a smuggling racket, so which went around all these Roman import bans. So ultimately, the Romans did the obvious thing. They began to lower the amount of gold and silver in their coins. So if you look at archaeological sites and you see Roman coins, you will find that the Roman coins, the amount of gold and silver in them keeps deteriorating because they keep debasing their coins. Now, I'm sure the Indians realized what was going on, but what is interesting is how they responded to it. They responded essentially by continuing to accept these coins, even though they knew they had less gold in them. In fact, they actually seem to have thought it's a good thing because now there was less gold and silver in it. They began to create fake Roman coins. So there was a large business in India in those times of faking Roman and Greek Roman coins of Indian origin. Now this, as you will notice, is very similar to what is going on today. The Chinese export to the Americans. The Americans complain that they are running a very large deficit with the Chinese. So how do the Americans pay for it? Well, they print a lot of extra dollars and they just give these pieces of paper to the Chinese. The Chinese know that the Americans are printing too many dollars, but they keep accumulating reserves. So this is how the world keeps going around. So roughly speaking, that was what was going on between India and the Roman Empire during that time. Now, same thing was happening on the eastern coast. Indians figured out how to sail from the eastern coast of India to places like Java, Sumatra, and of course Bali. And if you've ever been to Odisha in November, you'll know that they have a very big festival there called during Kartik Purnima, and during which basically what they do is they go to any water body and they put a paper boat with a lamp in it. What it really is a memory of the time in which these huge Indian fleets would set sail from India, going off towards Indonesia for trading. And even today, there is a festival near Cuttack called Bali Jatra, which literally means the voyage to Bali. So these people are all sailing off to Java and Bali and so on. And they were doing this. And so these were this was the heavy amount of trade going that is remembered even today in that Kartik Purnima festival. And why is Kartik Purnima festival done at this time? The reason they do it is very obvious because it happens in the middle of November when the full moon comes out. And this is about the time when the winds shift from blowing from south to north, which is the monsoonic wind, to blowing from the northwestern monsoon, from blowing from north to south. So if you wanted to sail to Southeast Asia, you want the wind to be from north to south. And I've been myself to Odisha during the Kartik Purnima and celebrated it on the beach near Konarak. And this is precisely what happens. The winds suddenly switch at about that time from blowing from south to north to blowing from north to south. So it's quite fascinating how all this happens. Now, if you are under the impression that all of this trade is only being done by individual heroic merchants setting sail in individual ships, then you are totally wrong. That may have been the case at the time of Kaundi in the very beginning, but certainly by the medieval period, what you have is huge corporatized guilds that were carrying out this trade. So this is not individuals going out, but these guilds, which had hundreds of shareholders. So they were like multinational companies, which were trading on one side with the Romans and later on with the Byzantines and Persians and the Arabs. And the other side, they were trading, of course, with Southeast Asia, with the empires of the Angkors and Srivijaya and Majapahit and so on. So these are big guilds. And there were also artisan guilds with which, and who was financing all of this? Well, it turns out that the financing of all of this was done by the temples. So, ever wonder why there was such a lot of gold in the temples? Now, usually people think that, the kings used to always hand over all their wealth to the temples. That is totally not the case. You see, politicians, even in medieval India, were not going to part with their money. So, getting Indian politicians to part with their money is never an easy thing. It was always true even at that time. So yes, some of the kings built huge temples because they obviously wanted to project power and be remembered, but they were not handing all their money to these temples. The reason these temples had money was that they functioned as banks. That is why they had such a lot of gold. And they were making their money essentially through venture capitalism, essentially by funding these huge voyages. And so even today, you have in some of the South Indian temples which survived the later destruction of temples during the Turkic period, you have these copper plate contracts. And these contracts are very often triangular contracts. Some of them are for building infrastructure and so on. But many of them are loans to merchant guilds who also have contracts with artisan guilds to produce so much cloth. And if this cloth was then given to the merchant who would then sell it and so on, and the interest rate, etc., is all defined in there. So you had these complex contracts and networks all over the Indian Ocean run by the Indians. And so if you came to India around about the beginning of the 11th century, this is what world trade would have looked like. It would have looked, you had the Fatimids dynasty of Egypt, and they were trading with the Cholas of southern India, and the Cholas by this time had created a fairly big empire, conquering much of South India and Sri Lanka. And then they were trading through Southeast Asia with the Sumatrans and the Javans, and they were making their way all the way to the Song Empire in China. So this was the highway of trade, and much of this was done by these guilds that I just mentioned, and financed by these huge and rich financing banks run by the temples. Now, obviously there was a lot of geopolitics happening in all of this as well. And let me give you a flavor of some of the geopolitics of that time, which involved, by the way, both India and China. As you can imagine, there were two ways of getting from India to China. One was through the Malacca Straits, which was between Sumatra and Malaysia, the Malaya. And the other was through the Sunda Straits, which was between Java and Sumatra. Now, typically, the Srivijayan empires of the Sumatra controlled the Malacca Straits, and the Javans controlled the Sunda Straits. That was the normal state of being. Now, in the beginning of the 11th century, around about 1015 AD, what happened is the Javans defeated the Sumatrans and began to push them back. So the Sumatrans reached out to the Song Empire of China and asked them for help. So with the help of the Chinese, the Sumatrans pushed back the Javans and came in for the very first time in control of both the Malacca Strait and the Sunda Strait. Now, the moment they controlled both the routes, they began to do what all monopolists do, which is they began to extract large amounts of rents, which obviously caused a lot of problems. And this cheesed off the Cholas. So the Cholas sent in 1017, they sent a small expedition to warn the Sumatrans that they were not happy about this. But in 1025, they sent a huge fleet from Nagapattinam. It's just south of Pondicherry, which was the main port of the Cholas. From Nagapattinam, a huge fleet set sail, and they made their way through the Sunda Straits and into the Malacca Straits. And there they basically sacked a whole bunch of Srivijaya ports. And then they went to Kadaram, which is in North Malaysia right now, just near the border of Malaysia and Thailand. And there they trapped the main Sumatran army and completely destroyed it. Having done that, they then came back. So this was done during the time of Rajendra Chola. And some of you even may know it from your history textbooks. And after this, basically the Sumatrans behaved themselves and trade resumed as well. Now, what is interesting on all of this is the Chinese made no attempt in all of this to support their Sumatran allies. Now, why was that? We do not really know. But it's quite possible that they were just as cheesed off with the Sumatrans and that they had an understanding with the Cholas. Because just a little bit later, we see a joint mission going from the Cholas along with the Sumatrans to the Chinese court. Now, this world lasted till about the beginning of the 13th century. And I'm going to end here, but you'll find this quite interesting. What happens is that this world that I just described falls apart completely. There are these massive hordes that come out of the Central Asia. And at about the same time, they sack all these three cultures. The Mongols sack China. They also sack the Middle East. And they sack the Turks. But the Turks, in turn, come into India and they completely destroy India, ransack the place. And waves of this happen after Mahmud Ghori. And so you have the Ghurids destroy the north, but of course, even before the Ghurids, the Ghaznavids had already sacked Gujarat and many of Mathura and so on. And then there are waves and waves of this. You have the Khiljis with Malik Kafur come and sack the southern Indian temples and so on. And there's absolute chaos. And the old system I just described also falls apart. Meanwhile, while the Turks are sacking India, Genghis Khan is sacking China and destroying the Song Empire, and his generals are at about the same time sacking Baghdad, and the whole system just gets destroyed. In India, this is particularly bad because they target the temples for religious purposes, perhaps, but also because they had a lot of gold. And this has a cataclysmic effect on Indian economic power because it essentially destroys the very financial basis of our ability to run these huge mercantile networks across the world. And India, from this point, basically, as a maritime power, goes into decline. The western coast areas sort of get taken over by the Arabs. But in Southeast Asia, you have the rise of the Indonesians under the Majapahit Empire. And they begin to take over. China goes through, of course, a period of Mongol occupation. But about the 15th century, the beginning of the 15th century, the Mongols are thrown out by the Chinese under the Ming dynasty. And having established by the late 14th century, they had established enough of power in the terrestrial power. In the very early part of the 15th century, between 1400 and 1430, the Chinese then built a huge mercantile and naval fleets. And this was all done under a general called Admiral Zheng He. And he was the most unlikely person to have done this because he was a Muslim eunuch from the landlocked province of Yunnan. But nevertheless, he was the personal attendant of the new Ming king, the Ming emperor. And he obviously trusted this eunuch and he put him in charge of the navy. And Zheng He invested in a huge navy. And some of the ships that were built at that time by the Chinese are just enormous. They're in modern scales. They were, Columbus would be sailing almost a century later, but, the ships that we are talking about are 5 to 6 times larger than what Columbus would be sailing. So they were the mercantile capabilities of the Chinese in the early 15th century was just extraordinary. And some of these fleets had something like 20 to 25,000 people in them. And so these huge fleets made their way down along the southern coast of China and down through Southeast Asia. And they made their way through the Malacca Straits into the Indian Ocean. and they visited Sri Lanka, they visited India, they visited African coast, from where they took back giraffes and other things. And there were a series of these voyages. Now, the initial voyages were, of course, purely for trade, but very quickly they began to become a geopolitical power. Now, by this time, mind you, the Indians were no longer a very major maritime power. There was a significant empire being built out in India, which was the Vijayanagar Empire in southern India. But the Vijayanagar Empire was, even though it relied heavily on trade, with mercantile trade itself, it was not a very major mercantile power. It may have had some fleets, but no, not very powerful. What they did have was that they'd have a lot of competition from the Indonesians, the Majapahit. And so the geopolitics of that time was the Indonesians versus the Chinese. And so the Chinese began to do something quite interesting. Remember, these empires in Southeast Asia at this point were all Hindu or Buddhist empires. So the Chinese then backed the kings of Malacca to convert to Islam. And with Chinese backing, a Muslim empire began to evolve in what is now Malaysia, in Malacca, and slowly began to push the Majapahit back. And so it was with this that the Islamization of Southeast Asia happened. It was essentially a Chinese geopolitical maneuver. And you begin to see the Majapahit Empire begin to slowly back off, till ultimately the last of the Majapahits moved out of Java and moved for a last stand into Bali. So this is the reason when you go to Bali, even today it is 95% Hindu. It is the last stand of the Majapahit Empire against the Chinese. But just at the moment that it appeared that the Chinese were going to dominate at least the Indian Ocean and known Asia, known world of that time, geopolitics was taken over by the internal politics in China itself. What happened is that the old Ming emperor died and a new Ming emperor came to the throne. And this new emperor had come to the throne with the backing of the Confucians. And the Confucians hated the eunuchs. Now, the eunuchs, as I just told you, ran the navy. So the Confucians did what good bureaucrats always do. So the Confucian mandarins essentially switched off the money to the navy. And so the navy went into severe decline over the next several decades. So after Zheng He died, the Chinese navy essentially rapidly over the next several decades lost its power. Now this created a vacuum in the Indian Ocean. Remember, the Chinese had come there, they had cleaned out everybody else, destroyed the Majapahit Empire, pushed back everybody, and so on. And then they had, for their own internal reasons, just disappeared. And so this left a vacuum in which the Portuguese turned up. Vasco da Gama turned up in the end of the 15th century, in 1495, 96, I forget, 97, I think. And he turned up in an Indian Ocean where there was no competition. And this is the reason that the Portuguese were so quickly able to take over. You wonder sometimes if the Indian Ocean had so many empires coming and going, how were the Europeans, a tiny country like Portugal, able to take over all these places? It wasn't even the large empire of the Spanish which took over the Indian Ocean, but the Portuguese. How did they do it? Why did Vasco da Gama manage to do all of this? Well, the reason was that they just before them, the Chinese had been there, knocked out everybody else, and then gone home. So this is the history, ladies and gentlemen, of how the Europeans came to dominate the world. It had everything to do with Chinese geopolitics and then ultimately Chinese bureaucrats. With that, let me stop, because I'm sure there are a lot of, we can have an interesting conversation after this. I think you're on mute.
Oh, wow. I think it is a revelation in history, which most of us studied everything about the Mughal Empire, but we did not even realize all the geopolitics of a maritime empire. But you were explaining to me when we had a brief call about the cyclical nature of the economy. And once again, we are facing a new cycle, perhaps. And I wonder what you would think about relating history to what we are going through now.
Yes, so one of the most important things to know about structural breaks in history is it is whatever we re-inflate in the post-COVID world is not a return to the pre-COVID world. This is one of the most important lessons of history. It will take a completely unknowable turn. It's very difficult to predict what it will be. But just as I told you, if you were sitting in 1450 and were predicting the next century, you would have almost certainly predicted a Chinese-dominated world. It turned out to be a Portuguese-dominated world, followed by a Dutch-dominated world, followed by an English-dominated world. Now, nobody would have given you that sequence of events. So the first thing to learn about structural breaks is exactly that. They are structural breaks. Don't have cobwebs in your head about re-establishing and going back to the pre-COVID world. No part of the world is going back to the pre-COVID world. The geopolitics of this new world will be different. The supply chains of this new world will be different. The technologies of this new world will be different. The consumer behavior of this new world will be different. So how we adapt to it is 99% of the game. It is not about having any preconceived notions about where you came from. That is the first lesson that you need to learn from history.
So
the second most important thing to learn from it is that fortune belongs to the brave. Risk, it is all about the ability of a society to be able to allow huge amount of risk taking. We were a great civilization because, some chap called Cordelia got into a small leaky ship and went off from somewhere along the east coast of India, sailed to Thailand, crossed the Isthmus of Crown Foot, sailed further to the Mekong Delta, married a local lass and set up an empire. That was the attitude we used to have at one point in time. This is, by the way, not so different from the attitude, say, the Spanish had. They, one guy Columbus in a leaky ship turned up in the Americas and discovered a whole continent, or Vasco da Gama. So that turned up just by luck at the right moment in the Indian Ocean, and the Portuguese took the whole place over. So the fortune belongs to the brave. So if we as a civilization, as a country, want to do whatever we want to do into this future, we have got to have risk-taking and flexibility. So this is a very important thing, that as a culture, we need to have a culture of risk-taking. We need to be willing to fail and to do completely crazy things. And this is true of later history as well. I mean, if you think about it, the British conquest of India is the most crazy thing at one level. The East India Company had just 2,000 Indian soldiers and a few dozen British soldiers at the Battle of Plassey. So Robert Clive was leading a ridiculous group of people. As I said, 2,000 soldiers who were Indians and maybe a few hundred at most European soldiers, facing 60,000 soldiers from the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla. And now we usually get told this story that, the British won because they bribed Mir Jafar. Well, even if Mir Jafar had left the battle with a few 10,000 soldiers, it made no difference. The difference in number of soldiers was so ridiculously large that Siraj-ud-Dawla had to basically simply walk forward, but he didn't. So the extraordinary gall of somebody like Robert Clive, you have to admire it. He was absolutely not a good man. He was a plunderer. He was an adventurer. But you have to take the utter gall of this guy with this tiny army to simply take on a huge kingdom and simply conquer it. So this is, I think, one of the most important things. And this is true for exploration. This is true of business. It is true of all these other things. It had a lot to do with the sheer gall of doing some of these things. And India had that spirit of risk-taking in ancient India. When we are proud of ancient India, remember, the thing that we are really proud of is really an extraordinary spirit of adventure that we somehow lost somewhere along the way. And somewhere along the way, we imposed on ourselves this fear that crossing the seas was a bad thing. So by the 16th, certainly by the 14th, 15th century, we had these rules which said that if you crossed the seas, you would, was a bad thing. So for a long, long time, many communities in India had rules against crossing the seas, which were many people had, in fact, as recently as my great-grandfather's time, 100 years ago, these rules were still extant. So where did these rules come from? It was a colossal loss of civilizational confidence that had happened. And it's only in the 19th century, with indentured labor going abroad to places like Fiji and Mauritius, etc., that Indians began to travel abroad again. And then Indian soldiers, as part of the First World War, then went abroad. Gujarati traders went out to East Africa. Chettiar moneylenders went out to Southeast Asia. So it's only in the late 19th century that Indians began to travel abroad again after almost 500 years of not doing so. So the point again to be made is, yes, we are facing difficult times. So is the rest of the world. But the most important thing to know about this is that we should not lose our confidence in ourselves.
Absolutely. So here's a question from the Rigveda. We know that metallurgy was important, and as Shell so nicely did on his drums, that we knew the science of metals and that we knew the science of warfare. And maybe we knew more about mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy than that time in civilization. So could you say more about that? And what was the impact of the Greeks, the light-eyed invaders from the north, and how did they impact the rest of India?
So this whole idea of light-eyed invaders from the north is utter bunkum. There is no evidence of it in our genes and no archaeological evidence of it at all. The word Arya in the Rigvedas simply means people who are noble, which means that every tribe mentioned there mentions themselves as noble and the enemies as Anarya. There is no systematic ethnicity. It does not have any ethnic connotation in the Rigveda. So if you read the Rigveda, it is a people who are very clearly describing a landscape which is in India. There is nothing in the Rigveda which suggests any knowledge outside of the following area, which is Haryana, some bits of Punjab, Western UP. There is some knowledge of an ocean somewhere to the south, but the real landscape described in the Rigvedas is that of the area called the Sapta Sindhu. Now, what is the Sapta Sindhu? Now, very often in the textbooks, you will find, completely wrongly, 5 rivers of the Punjab and maybe Yamuna and maybe the Saraswati. This is utterly wrong because nowhere are those 7 rivers mentioned in this way in the Rigveda. The Rigveda clearly mentions the following. First of all, you have to know where the Saraswati river is. There is something called the Nadi Stuti Suktam in the Rigveda, which clearly enumerates all the rivers in order from the Ganga to the rivers of Punjab. And it clearly places the Saraswati between the Yamuna and the Satluj. And there is one obvious dry riverbed there of the Ghaggar, which I mentioned, is almost certainly the dry riverbed of the Saraswati. Our texts, later texts like the Mahabharata, talk about, by the way, the drying up of the Saraswati. So again, it's not, the drying up is also mentioned in our texts. Now this river, Saraswati, had a lot of rivers flowing into it. And if you look at a satellite photograph, you can see many of them going there. In fact, one of these, the tributaries that flow into this Ghaggar is even today called Saraswati in Haryana. And because you had a relatively wet climate, they were all it was a better climate with all these rivers flowing. So it's really the Sapta Sindhu relates to the Saraswati and its tributaries. So this is what is the landscape you're talking about. Now, why is this landscape of interest to the Rigveda? Because it keeps on going about how wonderful this landscape is. The reason for that is that this landscape was the homeland of a tribe called the Bharata tribe, or the Trutsus were the sub-clan of the Bharatas. And this was the landscape they lived in. And they describe one major political event in the Rigveda, which is almost certainly true. It's not mythological because there's so many details there, so it's almost certainly true. It mentions a battle called the Battle of 10 Kings. And it's a battle fought by the Bharatas who came from this area, which is roughly Haryana today, with a coalition of 10 tribes which were coming in from the west. And they mention a whole bunch of names, the Anus, the Druhyus, the Parasas, and so on, a whole bunch of tribes. And this coalition had a huge army, and they were coming in and they were attacking the Bharatas. So the Bharatas, led by a chieftain called Sudas and his rishi, Vashishta, who was his guru, they organized a defense and they crossed the Saraswati River. And there was a huge battle on the banks of the Ravi, in which the Bharatas completely destroyed the 10 tribes. They mentioned that 6,600 of the enemy were killed, and the rest were drowned in the river and so on. They clearly described that. And with that, the Bharatas created the first empire, known empire of northern India, of India at all, that we know about. Then they turned eastward and they defeated another chieftain called Bheda on the banks of the Yamuna. So basically they ended up with an empire which was eastern Punjab, Haryana, and some part of western UP. But then they did something absolutely astounding, which is the reason we remember them, and we eventually ended up calling our country after this tiny Haryanavi tribe. Now the custom, as you can imagine, everywhere in the world was, if a tribe won over other tribes, especially the way I described, what they did is they imposed their gods on all the other tribes. But the Bharatas did something totally different. They told all the defeated tribes, and in fact even the non-defeated tribes that they had nearby, they told all their wise men and even women to send all their knowledge, and they compiled it all into one text. And this is the text we now know as the Rigveda. The Rigveda is the compilation of all the knowledge that the Bharatas put together over the subsequent several generations. And the Rigveda is very interesting because the Rigveda then basically created, therefore, a system of assimilation. So the Rigveda is considered the beginning of Hinduism. But it is not the beginning of Hinduism in that, unlike, say, Muhammad came and he proclaimed, say, Allah as God. So, there's a clear beginning. Or Christ, the death of Christ on the cross is the beginning of Christianity. Or, Abraham hearing from God is the beginning of Judaism. That is not how Hinduism starts. The Bharatas make no claims that the gods they are proclaiming are new gods. So if you read the very first shloka of the Rigveda, it starts by saying, it mentions the gods as worshipped by both the modern rishis and by the ancient rishis. So here we are somewhere in the Bronze Age, Bharata tribes saying, these are our gods, and they are the gods of all the rishis, and they are not just modern rishis, we are also praying to the ancient rishis. And then they do something, they take all of this, and then if you read the very last chant of the Rigveda, they say, come together, sit together, let us sit around the fire. There is a place around the fire for all the ancient gods. So what are they doing? They are compiling all the ancient gods. So this is an assimilative idea. So the Rigveda basically creates this template for assimilation. And therefore, this template of assimilation then allows you to keep adding new gods along the way. And that is how the Indian culture came to be. This is the culture of assimilation. And over time, we added gods which were further and further away. But this is the reason when we signed up to becoming the Bharatas, we were signing up not, see, I am a Bengali, I am from Bengal, I am not from Haryana. So why do I consider myself a Bharata? Not because I belong to the Bharata tribe, but because I signed up to this civilizational idea. So this is the nature in this. And so by the time you have the Puranas, you have this chant there which says, south of the snowy mountains, but north of the deep ocean, live the Bharatas and the sons of the, live the descendants of the Bharatas. This land is called Bharatvarsha. So this idea by this time has already spread, as you can see. But the idea comes originally from this Haryanavi tribe who were on the banks of this Saraswati River. Now the question is, who were these Bharata tribe? Now one thing we are told is all these Rigveda come from Aryas who came from Central Asia. Now the problem here is that, and then these Aryas came in, they destroyed the Harappan cities and all these kinds of things. But there is a problem in this story. And the problem is that the Rigveda clearly mentions that the Saraswati River was in full flow. And we now know from doing modern surveys of oxygen ion surveys, you've done carbon dating, all kinds of surveys have been done on the Ghaggar River. And we know exactly when it dried up. It first went through one round of drying up around about 3000, before 3500 BC. And then it completely dried up around 2000 BC. Now, the Rigveda does not mention any drying up of the Saraswati River. It mentions clearly that the Saraswati River was a big river and it flowed all the way down to the ocean. So this is a civilization that almost certainly predates 3500 BC, which not only predates this Aryan invasion of supposedly 1500 BC, which can't be true because the Saraswati River had dried up by then, but it also predates, incidentally, all the Harappan cities. So the Rigveda is older than the Harappan cities, which of course makes complete sense because the landscape they are describing is of small towns. It doesn't have large cities, but it does have small towns. But it is not a nomadic civilization. It is a settled civilization. You know, Indra is called the Purandara, destroyer of forts. And of course, the Indus civilization had forts. But you are probably dealing with an early Harappan or proto-Harappan period and of a culture that had already spread across northern India before the rise of the Harappan civilization. And here comes something very interesting because in our own texts, the later texts after the Harappan, after the Rigveda, we mention many of these things. We mention the drying up of the Saraswati. For example, Balram in the Mahabharata does does a pilgrimage to a place called Vinashana. Where is Vinashana? Well, it's somewhere in the Thar desert, and he says it's probably maybe somewhere around Pushkar. And he says that, you know, this river, Saraswati, has dried up and it only flows as far as Vinashana. It no longer flows to the sea. So again, already you have. And then when Bhim kills Duryodhana, he does it on the banks of the Saraswati. But it's mentioned by this point that the river had no longer flowing and had become a series of lakes. So we can clearly see what the time frame is. We also have other interesting anecdotes of who these people were, the Rigvedic people. So the Rigvedic people do not have iron. They only know about copper. Now this makes very good sense because where do you have copper mines in northern India? Well, you have it in Khetri. Khetri is where? On the border of Haryana and Rajasthan. By the way, it's only a 2-hour drive from Delhi. And I've been to Khetri. But even close to Khetri, there is a hill called Dhosi Hill. And if you go to the top of Dhosi Hill, it's very interesting because that was where a rishi called Bhrigu used to live. Now, Bhrigus are very interesting because the Bhrigus, if you read the Rigveda and even later texts, you will see that Bhrigus are very feared rishis. You know, all their lineage, they are kind of fierce family of rishis, the Bhargavas. And they seem to not be particularly interested in philosophical issues, but they seem to be alchemists. So what were they doing there? But, Bhrigus are always feared by everybody. What were they doing there? Well, guess what? If you go to the top of of this Dhosi hill and just look over, what do you see? Khetri hill. The next hill is Khetri. So it's obviously these Bhrigus were sitting there, essentially doing, they were alchemists. They were basically refining copper, making bronze weapons. And these bronze weapons were being used by the Bharatas. And not surprisingly, they had, by virtue of controlling the Khetri hills, Khetri mines, they had better bronze weapons and they were able quite easily to defeat these 10 tribes. And there's, of course, the other thing you can see from this Dhosi hill, which is Rakhigadi, which is, of course, a major Harappan site. And you can also see the dry riverbed of the Gaggar.
Amazing. So there's a question on the impact of India. You briefly mentioned it on Cambodia, the Angkor Wat temples, and also on Japan. We see many Indian words in the Japanese dialects. We see Buddhist thoughts. Many ways in which they live is very similar to what we do. Can you mention that line also?
So there was definitely a huge amount of impact on that part of the world from Indians. This impact is very often only talked about in terms of Buddhism. But in fact, there are many other impacts. For example, Korean history begins with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. And many Koreans, especially who come from noble lineages, very often claim that their matrilineal lineage is Indian. And for a long time, the Korean national flag in ancient medieval times had two fish in them. Now, just so that you're interested, if you go to Ayodhya, now of course the temple is being built and you meet the local Raja of Ayodhya, guess what is their local symbol, the symbol of the local prince? Two fish. So this is very interesting. Now this was true in many other places as well. On the Chinese coast, there are lots of Hindu temples, by the way. But in Japan too, there's a lot of influence of India. And the term Shinto, which is the non-Buddhist part of the religion, is, by the way, directly derived from Sindhu, or what the Persians called Hindu. So the word Hindu or Shinto are the same word. They basically all come from Sapta Sindhu. And this is the religion of Sapta Sindhu. And so if you go to Japan, Japan is full of Saraswati temples. It has lots of Ganesha temples. This idea of separating Buddhism and Hinduism is actually all bunkum. This is a modern separation. Hinduism and Buddhism have always been extremely closely related. Of course, the Hindus consider Buddha as the ninth avatar of Vishnu. But if you go to many other places, you will see, for example, you'll go to, there are more Brahma temples in Bangkok than all of India. And Angkor Wat, of course, was a Vishnu temple. So there is a lot of influence of India in all these areas. And of course, Bali remains a Hindu place. In fact, if you want to see medieval Hinduism, the best place to see it is actually in Bali, not in India. Because in India, we in many ways compromised our rituals and ideas to compromise with Islam and later on with the European occupation. The Indonesian Hindus did not compromise. So at one end, of course, they tried to remain pure by withdrawing into Bali. So, but in that tiny place, they have managed to maintain it in a much more pure form. So many of the ancient Hindu ideas have been better preserved in Indonesia than in India.
So Sanjeev ji, I'm a doctor and I studied history in school, but the history that you taught us today is completely different. So maybe it's time for us to rewrite our history textbooks. In these 2-3 months of lockdown, every weekend we kind of spend time doing historical talks, because for some reason it takes us to a kinder, gentler world. Maybe in the old days they also had troubles, but somehow it's different from the reality that we are facing outside today. And so history has been our savior, so to speak, to uplift our spirits, to help us to realize that the struggle is not over and that we can manage it. So before we end, I want you to again say how we can meet your cycle of time and how we can face the future.
Well, as I said, India is a very ancient civilization. It has been through many, many cycles. Whatever we are going through is actually quite minor compared to many of the cataclysmic shocks of history. Indian history, I'm sorry to say, is not a kinder and gentler history. It is actually quite a brutal history. But the story is therefore not of a kinder, gentler history, but of our resilience as a civilization. So that is the real takeaway from our history. Not that we lived in a kinder, gentler time, but that we are a genuinely resilient people. No other civilization has, from the Rigveda, which is perhaps 6,000-7,000 years old. As I said, it's significantly older than Harappan sites. And from that time to now, we have basically kept our civilization alive. And through good times and bad, there is nowhere in the world where the Gayatri mantra, which was composed in the early Bronze Age, is still used in daily use by millions of Hindus. The Nadistuti Shuktam is still done. We still remember the Saraswati River, which has dried up 4,000 years ago, every 12 years in the Kumbh Mela. Now, when you go and visit the Kumbh Mela, it's obviously supposed to have 3 rivers there. The 2 rivers are obvious, the Yamuna and the Ganga. And the 3rd river, Saraswati, is mythologically supposed to meet it there. Now, many people think that it is some sort of a mythological idea of another literal river that flows there. That is not the case. What it is really is the river of our civilization. What we are doing every 12 years at Kumbh Mela is remembering that our civilization began on the banks of this river, which no longer exists. So when we go there, we see the 2 rivers that obviously exist, but you also remember this 3rd river, which no longer exists, which we have now deified as the river of knowledge, but is actually the place where our civilization began. That is what we are doing. And it is very, very likely that as these Harappan cities were being abandoned, that the migrants that came there brought with them a pitcher of Saraswati's last waters and poured it there. That is the Kumbha. Kumbha literally means a pitcher. And this idea, by the way, is still alive in many ways. So when people from Eastern UP and Bihar in the 19th century were sent to Mauritius, they did the same thing. They took 1 pitcher of Ganga Jal to Mauritius and poured it into a lake there, which they now consider to be as sacred as the Ganga. And every year when there are festivals, Hindus in Mauritius go and take a dip in Ganga Talao in Mauritius. So the same idea of civilization has continued all these thousands of years. Thank you very much.
Sanjeevji, your message of resilience, we will never forget. Thank you so much for spending time. We know you're working every day, looking after the country, but taking 1 hour to raise our spirits. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I can see so many, we can go on talking for maybe days on end on this fascinating history.
Maybe next time you're in Delhi, we can have a dinner and we can.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your time. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.